It was gradually borne in on me that among the relatives of the high priest, it was his youngest brother-in-law, Hanan, who exercised the greatest influence in the conduct of the affairs of the temple. He was, in fact, the power behind the throne. The old high priest had a particular love for his youngest son. All Jews have a special weakness for the children of their old age, and had called him by his own name. Hanan ben Hanan was not only the cleverest of the brothers, he was also preeminent in character. Young as he was, I guessed him to be in the early 20s. He had already set himself definite goals, and he thrust his way through to them with resolute elbows. I can still see him as if he stood before me, a tall frame, muscular limbs, a body hardened by athletic discipline and thickly covered with a hirsute growth. His short black beard, which was tended daily by a skilled Chaldean hairdresser, ran up to mingle with his heavy locks, so that his long face was completely framed in the black growth. From this circle the powerful nose stood out, casting a shadow on the narrow lips. His smooth, lustrous forehead cut deep into his dense hair. His eyes were like his father's. They looked out from under the protective barrier of his brows with arrogant and far-sighted brilliance. He was compact of energy from head to foot, and everything in him seemed to cry for immediate action. His hands were always clenched, as if about to take the offensive, his lips tense, as if about to utter a battle cry. He was in a state of continuous mobilization. One careless word, one unfriendly glance, and his limbs became rigid. The hair bristled on his chest, as though to pierce like a forest of spears through the covering of linen. Hanan ben Hanan was a born fighter, and there was occasion enough for fighting. It was no light thing either for us Romans or for the Jewish priesthood to retain power in Jerusalem, and the boy was hungry for power. Hunger for power shouted from his person, as it did, for that matter, from the person of his father. But while the old man had learned from long experience to go about its satisfaction with infinite cunning and patience, contenting himself with the outward show of the civil authority delegated to him by his son-in-law, Hanan ben Hanan was too young, too impetuous, and too inexperienced to conceal his envy of the regnant high priest. He knew that much water would have to flow even down the meager Siloa River before he could realize his dream. 3 older brothers stood between him and the high priesthood, and their ambition, if not as furious as his, still could not be gainsaid. Besides, in spite of his fondness for his youngest child, the old man wanted to live long enough to see every one of his 5 sons invested in the robes of the supreme religious office, and so far only the oldest, Eleazar, had achieved the distinction. And here was his son-in-law holding on to the position, apparently without intention of ever retiring to make way for his brothers-in-law. There was too much power and too much wealth concentrated in the high priesthood for any man to relinquish it willingly. Under these conditions, it was natural that there should develop between old Hanan and the regnant high priest a silent battle for the favor of the procurator. On the surface, it would seem that the high priesthood was family property. Its business was transacted by the group, and the income flowed into a common treasury. Actually, there was fierce competition for the office, expressing itself in the endless offering of bribes and gifts to the procurator, the proconsul, Vitellius in Antioch, and all the hordes of advisers and sycophants had the ear of the rulers. But still, Joseph Caiapha hung on, in his own quiet way, with all his yielding of the civil authority to his father-in-law. He was the more cunning and insistent of the two. His gifts were fatter. The bags of gold he sent to Caesarea were heavier. The end of it was that he triumphed as no high priest had triumphed before him. He clung to the office through the duration of an entire procuratorship. While Pontius Pilate was procurator, Joseph Caiapha was high priest. The hidden battle went on, but old Hanan knew he was fighting, at least for the time being, in vain, and indeed he concentrated most of his energies on the struggle to maintain the power of his sect, his class, and his family. Young Hanan, who had inherited the greatest share of his father's gift for rulership, saw clearly enough that the office of high priest in Jerusalem, like any other office, retained its power and significance only through wealth. Himself still far from possession, he was nevertheless interested in strengthening the throne which would some day be his. He had scarcely come to manhood when he set himself to organizing the income of the high priesthood on a purely commercial basis. The tithe or tenth of wheat and of other natural products, reserved by the law for the priesthood, is the exclusive property of the high priest and his family. The mass of the priests must be satisfied with the leavings of the sacrifices. The money income of the priests is likewise the property of the high priest, and he is free to dispose of it as he sees fit. More than this, the produce consumed within the temple itself, the flour for the holy bread, the herbs for the sacrifices, the incense and the distilled oils, the Egyptian flax for the looms at which the women weave the vestments and curtains of the temple, all these are considered sacred and may be supplied only by the high priest. And then there are the doves, which every woman must bring as a sacrifice for the birth of a child. They are not ordinary doves, obtainable anywhere. They cannot be trapped by anyone and offered for sale in the temple market. They must be of a pure breed, well tended, guarded from ritual pollution. They must be specially fed with permitted foods. The breeding of such doves has been taken in hand by the high priest, and they alone can be offered as a purification sacrifice by the women, who must pay for them the rate fixed by him. And what woman will not find the money for the doves, which will purify her, in order that she may once more fulfill herself in her womanly duties? Furthermore, the law which regulates the offering of a sacrifice of doves may be broadened so that the demand increases. The price had already risen from a silver to a gold dinar for a pair of doves without blemish. It was through the sons of the old high priest that I finally entered the circle of the gilded youth of Jerusalem. I discovered at long last that the Judean capital was not wholly the accursed and desolated city which I had imagined it to be. Behind the frontage of severe prohibitions, which was the tribute to their stern and jealous God, the aristocratic youth found highly cultured amusements like those of the aristocratic youth of any heathen city, and their enjoyment of life would have done credit to any Greek metropolis. This circle of the select was regarded with scorn and hatred by the populace, which gave it the contemptuous name of the heretics and accused it of atheism. But as far as I could see, the youth was merely driving to its logical conclusion the system of views held by the parents, the Sadducees. This was the argument. If all that life can offer us is the fate of the camel fallen in the wilderness, or the bird shot down by the hunter, what is the sense and purpose of restraining the natural impulse to joy and pleasure? Why should we not let the hours ripen happiness for us? Why should we hesitate to make full use of the position into which we have been born? If God has, indeed, placed you as a ruler over your brothers, is it not because he wants you to draw the reins tight and increase the burden they bear? They cited, further, the lines of one of their poets, "What is man, that thou art mindful of him?" The manner of their life was based, as one of their prophets remarked bitterly, on the principle, "Today let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." Thus they founded groups of young people, which at first met in secret, and later without any precaution of secrecy, the avowed purpose of which was to destroy the bonds and prohibitions laid upon them by their religion. They discovered the world of beauty and pleasure which their cruel law had closed to them, and they threw themselves with all the fury of their starved and passionate bodies into our joys. They quickly became adepts in all the varieties of enjoyment which long experience and traditional institutions had planted among us Romans. They were rich. Cost did not deter them. Soon enough their nocturnal banquets on rose-strewn platforms surpassed our own. There were gatherings of young men and women who, with their marvelously tended bodies, their education and culture, their singing and wit, would have graced the best society in Antioch, Alexandria, or even Rome. I must concede that they did add to these nocturnal affairs a note peculiarly their own. These were not the wild and uncontrolled bacchanalian revelries, free from every control of decency and shot through with erotic indulgence, which were common in Alexandria and were carried over from that city into our Hellenism. They, the Jews, brought into Hellenism a note, a modest rhythm, which somehow suggested restraint and decency, and at the same time had a special and more refined touch of provocation, like their perfumes and incenses. Their women never forgot themselves, and even when the gaiety and excitement reached the highest pitch, never showed themselves naked, but draped themselves in their long hair. But this was a draping of the body which touched the nerves more sharply, which was more naked than nakedness. Moreover, there was at all their banquets a perpetual mood of regret, subdued but insistent, breaking through the deliberate gaiety, a mood of elegaic meditativeness and recollection, as though it was impossible for them to liberate their minds completely from their ancient burden, and they were under a compulsion to name the name of death. Like the passing shadow, such is our life. There is no returning after the end. Let us taste the joys that lie before us, swiftly, while we still have youth. The circle of the aristocratic youth of Jerusalem to which I was admitted was frequented by a woman named Miriam, or Mary, and because she came from the city of Migdal on the Sea of Gennesaret or Tiberias, she was also called Magdalena, that is, Miriam of Migdal. The reputation of this woman was not without blemish, or perhaps I should say that her reputation varied according to the class that spoke of her. In our circles she was loved and honored. When I met her, she was no longer in her first youth. She was closer to that age of ripeness in which the Greek masters have always chosen to portray the goddess of love. She was the experienced mother type, with broad hips and full-developed breasts, which peeped out like modest doves between the red veils of her hair. There was a mild motherliness in her treatment of those who were admitted to her favors, and she distributed her favors according to need rather than reward, for she was capricious, full of surprises and fantasies, like a true daughter of her people. There were men of wealth who loved her, who had flung away fortunes to please her, who would have fulfilled the most arbitrary demands for the breath that came from between her lips. These she often ignored, letting them wither for want of her. Instead, it was to such as had never had the courage or the means to court her, or even to dream of courting her, to the unimportant, the poor, and the forlorn, that she offered her kindness. She distributed her favors as one distributes charity among the poor, that is, without seeking reward or return. I had heard a great deal concerning Miriam of Migdal, even before I met her, but who had not? All Jerusalem spoke of the woman who was said to exercise a profound influence on the sons of the oldest high priest, the leaders of the Jerusalem aristocracy. This had not a little to do with her popularity among the gilded youth, for anyone who aspired to social distinction in Jerusalem began by imitating the sons of the high priest. Miriam of Migdal, or Mary Magdalene, was skillful in the management of her life. Her favors were widely scattered, like the rain which falls on many fields. Her lovers would encounter each other, they knew of each other, and yet, in a strange way, there was no jealousy between them. Instead of creating enmities, she possessed the art of binding men together by their common love for her. I, too, I must confess, fell somewhat under her influence, for at our first meeting she made an unforgettable impression on me.